Now it's time to introduce you the second speaker. Would you like to go there? Yes. Francesco Ammannati, Dr. Ammannati received a degree in economics at the University of Florence in 2003 with a thesis entitled The Labor Books of Andrea Di Carlo di Messer Bartolomeo and Company, a case study which aimed to reconstruct the activity of a whole workshop acting in Prato in the second half of the 15th century, and a PhD at the University of Bari with a doctoral dissertation, Di Arte della Lana in Florence during the 16th century, comparative analysis in the production and productivity through the Busini Partnerships account books. His main research field is pre-industrial European economic history. His scientific interests include the history of manufacture and trade with a focus on guilds, labor market, and international merchant networks. He is also concerned about the evolution of the accounting practices between late Middle Ages and early modern time. He taught as an adjunct professor economic history course at the University of Florence, and since 2005 has collaborated with the Fondazione Istituto di Storia Economica Datini in Prato. At present, he is a research fellow at the ERC-funded project ENITE, Economic Inequality in Italy and Europe 1300-1800 at the Carlo Dondena Center for Research on Social Dynamics of the Bocconi University in Milan. And he teaches also the course Money and Banking Through the Centuries at CET academic programs in Florence. He will join the EMoBookTrade team in January 2017. I go to you.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Joran. I'm afraid that in my speech I will not present any result or results because I have just started to work on this topic, but I rather present you a brief summary of the conceptual framework in which my study will move and research issues, as well as the methodological problems which have to be addressed. Okay. So, more questions than answers, and I hope to gather some answer for you through the discussion. As Angela said before, this project touches two very important topics and classic subjects of economic history research: consumption history and price history. Since the second half of the 20th century, starting from the school of the Annales and the interest on material culture, consumption history has been an object of research. Since the 70s, it has developed according to a more problematized interpretation, trying to connect the dynamics of consumption in the modern age to the development of the European economic system in view of the Industrial Revolution of the 17th and 18th century. In this sense, a new concept has been rather successful in recent years, the concept of consumption revolution, which would be the basis of an industrious revolution, in turn caused by an intensification of the work of the households that has characterized the modern age. Is widely, although not universally accepted and still strongly debated, that in the 17th century a general increase in consumption and a change in consumption structure took place in Europe. The emphasis has traditionally been placed on colonial products or new types of fabric, for example, the so-called northern invasion of cheap, lightweight and colored clothes made in England or the northern Low Countries. Some authors attribute especially to the colonial products a crucial contribution to the birth of a modern consumer culture, although this revolutionary character is applicable to the increasing possession by low or rather medium social classes of goods not comparable in quality to the traditional luxury products, but able to embody the fundamental characteristic of modern consumption goods of being non-essential. Post-mortem inventories were the main source for historical analysis of this phenomenon, although heavily criticized for their obvious inherent limitation, as they cannot give a dynamic view of the composition of the wealth of a household. But this kind of source shows that since the 17th century, the number of objects possessed increased in general with the succession of generations. This phenomenon would involve even population layers which, throughout the same period, experienced a relative poverty, regardless of the general economic stagnation. This apparent contradiction finds its first motivation in the perception of the social significance of objects that became part of the family heritage as a sign of possessing, even if excessive generalization regarding emulation tout court are to be avoided. In a pre-industrial society, social mobility does not seem to be obtained through the adoption of forms of consumption typical of higher classes. Rather, these forms of consumption reveal a need to rise up within the same social group. However, economic and cultural historians have identified in consumption, especially but not only of luxury goods, the origin of the trend of attributing social meanings to goods and objects, forerunner of the consumerism in the modern sense. That is the cultural ground of an economy based on the continuous creation of new needs and new consumptions. In analyzing the object book, an economic historian might face the question, what kind of good is a book? Its nature of a semi-industrial good puts it from the point of view of a pre-industrial economy in a different product category, and the analysis carried out on many other goods are not directly applicable to the book. However, if we try to use the typical categories of supply and demand, the factors to be considered in its analysis are, from the supply side, production costs. Did the printing sector experience a technical evolution during the 16th and 17th century? Distribution costs. How did the emerging businessmen manage the placement of their products? How did distance affect the penetration into new or already known markets? How important were the networks built by these businessmen? Product differentiation. Once the serial production allowed them to play a role in fixing the prices determined by the encounter with the demand, how did operators try to differentiate the production depending on the type and the income level of the customers? On the demand side, the variable to be considered in general are the dynamics of the population, the dynamics of cultural consumption, and according to this particular aspect is mandatory to take into account the influence of the Counter-Reformation and the demand for religious texts that made up at least 1/3 of the global book market, the dynamics of real incomes and wealth, and the distribution among the population, and finally, the appearance or the rising of new middle social classes as seen before. A second contradiction, which intersects with the last question approached by the project, is the history of prices. Prices was deeply studied by economic historians who have estimated the erosion of the purchasing power of wages during the so-called long 17th century, an erosion that accelerated during the 18th century when prices reached the highest level since the Middle Ages, and real wages reached the lower ones, following, however, a secular trend. In a purely economic approach, prices and incomes are, as well known, essential variables that affect individual consumption, indirect function of per capita income, inverse of the price of the good, and indirect of the price of the other goods. The general trend in consumer prices in Europe, in direct correlation with that of the population at least until the 19th century, with its strong industrial and agricultural productivity increases, tells the story of the 16th century growth, a fall of stability in the 17th, and a surge in the 18th century. The intensity of the trend was different, though depending on where agricultural goods, much stronger, or manufactured goods, more modest. The price of manufactured goods grew less because even small increases in productivity took place in the secondary sector. This did not occur instead in agriculture, which still represented the main sector of the economy of the time and provided key input to the system for the production of all the goods and tools for workers, raw materials, fuels, etc. Jean de Vries, proposing the concept of industrious revolution, has tried to put a remedy to the contradiction that consumption increased while real wages decreased. He has implicitly refused, or at least strongly criticized, the use of general indexes of wages for evaluating consumption trends, judging these indices unsuitable for several reasons. He finds it necessary to consider not so much wages per capita, but family wages, and judges data used for the composition of the indexes hardly representative, as they are mostly referring to wages of unskilled and construction workers. Consumption, in his view, were not only linked to income, but came from a greater propensity to buy, which induced the family to work harder to be able to spend more. This consideration, however, apply especially to population layers, strata living on income from work or in general at levels slightly higher than the subsistence. The situation changes when we move towards families placed higher up in the social scala. It's well known that an increasing polarization of wealth characterized the modern age, at least for some regions of the Italian peninsula and the Low Countries. Studies about this respect don't allow for a moment further generalization, but it seems that the similar trend is noted for France, southern France, and Spain. While new para-aristocrats' consumption patterns had already taken hold since the Renaissance in the region with a more pronounced urban and economic development. In this case, historians agree on the description of growing consumption given the greater possibility of purchasing goods thanks to a consolidated wealth of land and a constantly increasing annuity, especially in periods of rising agricultural prices like the 16th and the 18th century. Nevertheless, a satisfactory and credible general price index is still to be established. The need to have similar values in time and space leads inevitably to take into consideration goods traded on large markets, excluding those excessively uneven by type, for example, houses, or for which self-consumption is predominant, often in the case of major agricultural products like wheat or potatoes. A reliable price index to be used for historical economic analysis also needs an index of wages for the period, and this problem is always present for the difficulty of recovering significant data sources. As I said, traditionally the series used are based on the salaries of employees in building activity, given the regularity in setting the daily, weekly, etc. wage, and more rarely mining. For example, one of the main sector of the economy of the time, the textile manufacture, especially in Italy, shifted toward an organization always more decentralized, in which salaries were set by piecework. So, against of a large amount of the available data, it's impossible to use them to establish a general real price index. For many areas, there are other problems. For example, the political fragmentation, which reflects in the variety of measurement system and, above all, in the variety of currencies for which it is necessary to always have in mind a comprehensive framework of international exchange rates. Above all these issues is also hovers the most general, the so-called price revolution of the 16th century. It was not an abrupt and short-term rise of prices, as they occurred, for example, in times of famine, but the ascent of a long period lasting and not related to contingent factor, or what economists call junctures. Traditionally explained by the massive arrival in Europe of silver, and to a lesser extent American gold, this monetarist view since the 50s was heavily criticized. The belief was that the phenomenon was actually far more complex than only monetary issues. The 16th century price increases were attributed to the demographic increase and the consequent imbalance between rising demand and agricultural production unable to meet it. If, in fact, from the second half of the 15th century, it had been possible to remedy to the population increase by putting many lands under cultivation and by reclaiming others, during that century, the 16th century, the cultivation methods were not substantially changed, and the productivity of the land, after a few years, inexorably tended to shrink, with the population continuing to grow. Therefore, this severe problem of inflation strongly influences any analysis of the trend of prices during the late Renaissance and the early modern period. And a final aspect that the story of the book as an object of consumption is recently gaining importance for the historical economical research is the connection to the economic growth and the role of human capital in this dynamic. One of the elements used by some economic historians to measure the latter parameter was precisely the consumption of books. Quite obviously, the historians of the development have linked the increase of the number of books printed and traded with the increase in the level and quality of human capital, one of the key elements for the development of the economy in an industrial sense. The debate among economic historians, often set in a heavy econometric key and with the massive use of sophisticated statistical tools, is just at its beginnings, and doubts about the possible validity of the consumption of books as an effective indicator of the evolution of human capital. Nevertheless, data that could emerge from a systematic study of the price of books are bound to contribute significantly to better define the boundaries of the matter. In short, to conclude, the case of books therefore cuts across both current historiographical issues, dynamic of book trade, helps to bring in new elements in the general theme of the composition and the patterns of consumption in the pre-industrial era, since they represent a perfect example of luxury good that becomes progressively populux. Moreover, the peculiar dynamics of distribution and price settling place books in an eccentric position with respect to the categories of goods traditionally used to compose general indexes, a reason why the results that an analysis of the data offered by the numerous sources gathered and analyzed in this project will be particularly valuable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this stimulating presentation. He gave us a context, a very rich context in which our research will develop, and is very promising for the future.